It's really an honor to introduce Professor Patler. Before the address, which she will present, I'd like to speak to you, especially you who are very young in here, from my heart. Try to imagine you are a 4-year-old and you're holding the hand of your sister. You're walking endlessly, often carried by mama or papa. The hand feels warm and it feels good, and it's helped you through water, mud, slime, and over tall things they tell you are mountains. They tell you stories about where you were going, someplace that feels good, that is free, that is beautiful, and you are hungry, scared, and cling to the hand which says, "Keep on, I love you, we will get there." When you arrive, it is not beautiful. You wait and wait with others in a long line. You are frightened, and they take away the hand that held you and felt good and gave you courage. They take you away from mama and papa. Other children are here too. They cry, you cry, and you are in a cage where they placed you, hungry, dirty, and scared. Is this happening in our beloved country? Years ago, I read a book called Cry the Beloved Country. It was about South Africa. And now I cry for my beloved country. It happens here. It happens abroad. Little children are lost. They are placed in cages. I cry when I look at pictures of the eyes of those little children. Dr. Patler will talk to us this evening about the psychological well-being for children, arrivals, and her qualifications are too numerous to mention. How fortunate we are to be able to hear Dr. Patler this evening. Her work has been described by scholars, which I am not. And so I'm grateful to you, Dr. Patler, for giving the Ackerman lecture. It is endowed by my husband, who knows the story of my family. My mother was a child slave in Russia. She also had a hand to hold and said to her, "Keep on, don't lose courage. You will get there, to the land of golden streets." When she got here, the streets were not of gold. And so your work in inequality in the United States and the consequences of legal vulnerability here are part of your lecture, and I look forward very much to hearing it. And now I give you Dr. Caitlin Packard.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much. Hope you get to hear. Well, thank you so much for that very warm introduction on this chilly night. Thank you to Dean David Birdsall. There. Okay, thanks. And to Rob Smith for the invitation. And I want to express my particular gratitude to the Ackerman family and the Engelman family for bringing us all together this evening. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here to share some of my research with all of you. And thank all of you for coming out on this chilly evening, which I know is the first of many chilly evenings. So as we've just heard, the Ackerman lecture is intended to focus on major issues of equity and justice. And I can think of fewer issues facing contemporary US society that are of such historical significance in terms of equity and justice than the treatment of immigrants in this country. I teach a large class on immigration at UC Davis. I'm a sociology professor. And I teach my students about the history of US immigration policy. And I always talk to them about how there have been several key junctures in US immigration policy that have come to be known as defining moments in immigration policy. And they're defining moments because they're moments in which our country made critical decisions about how to approach its most vulnerable populations, whether to open its arms and try to integrate immigrants and bring them into the community, or, unfortunately, much more commonly, by vastly restricting immigrants' rights. And I think we're living again in one of those times. And there's so much at stake. So what I'm going to do today is show you some findings from a research project I'm working on with a team at UC Davis that looks specifically at the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. And I will explain in detail what that program is in a minute. This is a project I've been researching for some time. And today I am going to focus our discussion on the extent to which DACA has impacted psychological well-being, both for DACA-eligible young people in California, which is the focus of my research, but also for their families. And their families include many very, very young US citizen children. And as you know, just 2 days ago, on Tuesday, the Supreme Court heard arguments about whether the termination of the DACA program was lawful or not. And that's a case that's going to decide the future of 825,000 young people who have been recipients of this program. So what I'm going to do today is show you how DACA itself, but also debates about DACA, how they have influenced health, both for recipients and for their families. And what I hope to illustrate is the fact that laws and policies and the debate about laws and policies are linked to stress. They can be linked to stress, and they're linked to well-being, and therefore they're linked to not just the well-being of the individual, but of our communities more broadly. So let me just start by giving you some information, more background on this topic. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to start by telling you about, we have to back up for a minute and talk about some of the disadvantages that undocumented young people face in order to understand how a program like DACA might then influence or change their well-being. So I'll start there, and then I'll show you some results from both quantitative and qualitative research that I've been doing on the DACA program for the last 8 years. And then I'll end with some sort of concluding thoughts about where I think we are in the present moment, because I think, what happened this week in terms of the Supreme Court hearing this case, this is a really historical moment. So I do want to have a brief conversation about that at the end. It may or may not surprise some of you in this room to hear me say that immigrant legal status is a central axis of inequality in contemporary US society. And what I mean by that is that legal status is linked to structural barriers, right, that lead to long-term inequities and disadvantages for undocumented immigrants. It basically divides immigrants into haves and have-nots. Studies that were conducted prior to the beginning of the DACA program show that undocumented immigration status is linked to poverty rates that are twice as high in undocumented families as they are in documented families. Some of my own research has shown that undocumented status is linked to barriers to high school completion and college enrollment. And I think critical for today's talk, studies also show that undocumented status is linked to increased incidence of mental health problems. But how does that happen, right? Undocumented status can undermine health in a variety of ways. First of all, just living in poverty, right? Having a kind of constant lack of access to resources, that can be a chronic stressor really for anybody, right? But perhaps especially for undocumented immigrants who experience barriers to lawful employment in the formal labor market, who experience lower wages, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to these material conditions, the immigrant experience in and of itself can also generate stressors, both chronic and acute stressors, and anticipatory stressors, including the fear of deportation. And anticipatory stress is stress about things that may or may not have happened yet, right? So we can worry about something. We feel anxious about something. We hear about it in the news, or one of our friends is deported, or a family member is deported. And that produces what's called anticipatory stress, where we experience stress about something that may or may not even have happened yet, right? And so deportation threat is something that has been known to be both a chronic stressor and an anticipatory stressor in people's lives. Relatedly, there's another term that researchers use called ontological security. And that refers to an individual's ability to count on the promise of the future, right? Someone's ability to count on how stable their future is going to be. And undocumented youth are an interesting group because they grow up here in the United States. They attend our schools. They are told that they should work hard, that they should go to college, that they can do it, right? But they can experience a loss of ontological security due to their undocumented status, which they see and understand and know has very severe barriers for their ability to truly be able to succeed. They can't count on the same returns to hard work that U.S. citizens can, right? They can't always even count on the ability to stay in the United States, in the place that they know as home. Undocumented youth also can experience psychological distress when their perceptions of themselves as human beings run up against the broader portrayals of them in society, right? These are called dissonant identity scenarios, when my vision of myself is in contrast to your vision of me or to society's vision of me. So if I perceive myself as a human being deserving of rights, but society does not give me that right to have rights, that can also produce great distress in people's lives. And all of these things together and other things influence people's health and well-being. But here's what's interesting. While we know that legal status is linked to a range of inequities, just a few of which I've just discussed, right? And we know that those inequities are linked to well-being, we know far less about one very, very straightforward remedy. And that is the regularization of legal status. Because here's the thing about legal status. You can change it, right? And you can change it relatively easily. Unlike other aspects of individuals' identities, or unlike other key axes of stratification that are linked to stigma and to barriers that produce disadvantage, what makes legal status unique is that policies can easily change it. Right? Legislators can flip a policy level and begin to unravel some of the inequalities based on legal status. They can eliminate some of those barriers. And that's how we can think about DACA in some ways, right? That's what DACA was, a policy lever aimed at incorporating undocumented youth into the fabric of American society. And President Obama, when he announced the DACA program in 2012, he said, this is a program targeted to young people who are, quote, Americans in every way but one, on paper, right? So he was very clear in the intention of this program when it was announced. So we can think of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program as sort of a natural experiment in some ways. So those of us who are academics and statisticians and are interested in measuring these kinds of things, like the impacts of legal status, because DACA is this large exogenous change that happens to a large group of people all at once, that allows us to actually answer the question that I just posed, which I posed more as a statement, which is what happens when you flip those levers? What happens when you actually provide an opportunity to regularize somebody's immigration status, even in a temporary way? And DACA allows us to answer that question about the flipping of that policy lever. And just to remind everyone, what did DACA do? The DA, the deferred action in DACA, is a status that has that dates all the way back to 1975 in U.S. immigration policy and has been given to groups of people over generations who the government is basically saying, I am not going to deport you. I'm going to defer any action on your deportation. When somebody gets that status, they also become eligible to apply for work authorization, which comes with several related benefits. And so those are the kind of key things that DACA did, right? Remove the imminent threat of deportation and provide access to work authorization. It was always a temporary program that could be renewed every 2 years. And to date, about 825,000 people have received benefits under the DACA program. The eligibility criteria, I'll just show this slide very briefly and emphasize that this was a program really targeting a particular group of young people who came to the United States as children and were high achieving in the sense that they had completed high school or the GED requirements, or were honorably discharged veterans. And so it targeted a very specific group of people that was maybe 16 to 20% of the undocumented population in total. So certainly not a broader policy that would impact everybody. But 825,000 recipients to date. But of course, as many of us know, in September 2017, the Trump administration announced plans to eliminate the program. And that was a threat that then candidate Trump had made on the campaign trail as early as the middle of 2015. So in an interview on CNN, when asked what he would do about programs like DACA, he said, they have to go. And then the interviewer says, even if that means separating families? And he said, they have to go. So this was as early as 2015 that these remarks were made, and then the Trump administration made good on those remarks in September of 2017. And of course, the legality of the announcement of the termination is what was at stake, what was at the heart of the Supreme Court debate on Tuesday. Not whether the program itself is legal. What the Supreme Court took up was whether the termination of the program was lawful or not. And, as was previewed earlier, the court will not likely make a decision until next year sometime, probably close to the end of the term, so, May or June. So I think the future of DACA recipients and other undocumented youth remains very uncertain today. And what I want to show you again today is that this uncertainty takes a psychological toll on people's lives. So what I'm interested in this project, the sort of academic focus of the project, and really the policy relevant focus of the project as well, is how has DACA impacted psychological well-being? Has it at all? And if so, how? Both for DACA eligible young people, and also how have those health benefits potentially spilled over onto other people who share households with DACA recipients. And in the case of my research, I'm talking about their own children who are very young US citizen children. But I'm also interested in whether or not DACA's impacts may have varied or changed or unfolded over time, especially because there's been so much debate about this program and about this status and so much attention to it. So have the impacts of the program been uniform over time, or have they varied? So those are the questions that I'm focusing on in my research. Okay. And I want to say that toward the end of the talk, I'll mention briefly some of the other very important and related work on DACA's impacts on employment, on education, on several other measures. And Professor Smith is leading the efforts. I see his research team here as well, leading efforts in this area to understand those impacts. But today I'm focusing in on health, and I'm doing that because I think, especially given what happened on Tuesday, and the overall uncertainty about the program, I think it's important to focus on health as a way to underscore DACA recipients' humanity as people, right? As living, breathing human beings who are impacted every day by the uncertainty of policies that are governing their lives. And indeed, they're very right to have rights. So without further ado, let me get to that. I use two sources of data in this project to really answer this question about the impacts that DACA may have had on psychological well-being. First, I draw from the California Health Interview Survey. And this is a large representative sample of California's population. The CHIS is the largest state public health survey in the country. It's collected by UCLA's Center for Health Policy Research in collaboration with the California Department of Public Health and the Department of Healthcare Services. It interviews about 50,000 Californians every year, and it is representative to our state's population. The cool thing about the CHIS, it's great for two reasons in terms of answering these particular research questions. The first thing is that it's actually very, very hard to identify undocumented immigrants in most large-scale surveys. There's usually just one question in most surveys that asks, are you a U.S. citizen or not? This survey has a series of questions that allow us to more closely approximate DACA eligibility by more closely defining who is undocumented. So that's one reason that I really like the CHIS, besides the fact that it has extensive measures of health and well-being that are really useful, of course, to the research questions that I'm interested in. The other thing about the CHIS is that it's a household survey. And so as I'll show you in a little while, I can also link parents with their own children. And therefore, I can identify the very young children of DACA-eligible parents. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by showing you some trends from the CHIS survey data, but then to really understand some of the mechanisms behind those trends, or the reasons that we might be seeing the results at the statewide level that we're seeing, I'm going to draw from the DACA longitudinal study, which is a study I've been working on with a group called Dream Team Los Angeles since 2012. It's a longitudinal study. That means it follows the same group of recipients over time, which is great because that allows us to assess change within the same individuals. And I draw on that study to really understand, in DACA recipients' own words, how the program may have impacted their health and well-being. So starting with the CHIS data, my analyses today of health and well-being rely on two very, very commonly used measures of health and well-being that are used very commonly across the social, behavioral, and medical sciences. When I am looking at children, I focus on the question that you see here. Would you say in general that your child's health is excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? Parents in the room will nod that you answer this every single time you take your child to the doctor and have to fill out intake forms. This is a very, very standard question. I'm actually going to talk about the children toward the end of the presentation, and I'll actually focus the bulk of my remarks on this measure of psychological distress, which is called the Kessler-6 question, psychological distress scale. And this is this scale was introduced in the 1992 National Health Interview Survey and is also used very broadly across the social, behavioral, and medical sciences. And here's the question wording. So the question asks, and this would be young children are not asked this question. This is asked of teens and adults. So our DACA eligible group will receive these questions. So they're asked to think about the last 30 days. And they're asked about how often during the past 30 days did you feel nervous? Would you say all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, a little of the time, or none of the time? And depending on how they answer, they get a score from 0 to 4. And then they're asked the rest of these 6 questions in a similar way. Hopeless, restless or fidgety, so depressed that nothing could cheer you up. How often did you feel that everything was an effort? And how often did you feel worthless? And so you have 6 questions, and you have a score from 0 to 4. So you can have a score of 0 to 24. And in general, a K6 score of, generally people are pretty low on this scale, around 4 or 5. But once you get to 5 and above, that score is supposed to merit clinical attention. Severe concerns would be at around 10 to 13 or higher, but a score even as low as 5, it tends to merit clinical attention. So what I do in this project is look at both the sort of raw scale, how have K6 scores changed in general throughout the life of the DACA program, and also this dichotomous measure of 5 or more and then 4 or lower. I use what's called a difference in differences regression model. It's a statistical model that allows me to compare DACA eligible immigrants to themselves, both prior to DACA and after DACA, so to look at that difference, but in relation to a control group that didn't receive DACA. And so in this case, that would be documented immigrants who share a similar age and educational profile as DACA eligible immigrants, but simply were not undocumented. And so that's why it's called a difference in differences, because you're comparing DACA recipients both to themselves prior to the program, but also to this other control group. And here today, the results I'm going to show you focus in on Latinx immigrants, given that that is the group that has been most likely to receive DACA, is most numerous within the DACA recipient population, and also because in California, the numbers of Latinx immigrants are high enough that we can actually produce reliable statistical estimates of the impacts of DACA. Okay, so let's take a look at the data. You've all been waiting, the moment you've all been waiting for. So this graph, what this does is it shows the average difference in K6 scores between the 2 groups. Okay, so let me just walk through kind of exactly what we'll be looking at here. It doesn't mean, it shows the difference between the 2 groups. So let's say that DACA eligible immigrants and undocumented immigrants have different levels of distress prior to DACA. We might expect that, right? We don't expect necessarily the 2 groups to be on the exact same, have the exact same levels of distress. But we do expect that absent some kind of treatment, right, in this case DACA, we would expect them to move along through life in a parallel fashion. Like more or less their scores could be different, but they would move along and their scores would remain parallelly different. And that would mean that they would have a difference in differences of 0. Are you following me? It's a little bit, the statistical aspect of it is a little bit tricky. But so basically what you're seeing here is that from 2007 to the beginning of DACA, which is the red line, you basically have 0 difference in difference. In other words, a statistical difference of 0 between the groups. So they may have been different, but they were not different from each other over time. Okay, so, but then DACA comes into play at the red line, and we see this really cool thing happen. So remember, this is stress. You want it to be lower, right? You want the difference to grow. And that's what you see happens, right? Average K6 scores during this time drop by more than 2 full points. And the likelihood of moderate or worse scores, so those scores of 5 or higher, decrease by around 40%. What you're seeing here is the raw score. So -2 means that the difference decrease, they're 2 points on average lower than that normal difference that you'd expect, which would be 0, right? So really significant and important differences, decreases in distress. And that's what we want. We want people to be less distressed. The spoiler alert, however, is that these improvements have not been sustained. And I will say more about both the decreases in distress and then the increases in distress. But what I want to say that overall, what you can take from this graph, the trends suggest that changes to mental health have not been uniform over time, right? That they've changed. That DACA's impacts have been dynamic. And what I want to do now is draw on some of my interviews with DACA recipients to help explain what happened at these key moments that influenced health, that influenced psychological well-being, first to improve it, and then to cause those improvements to disappear. And what DACA recipients tell me is that this dynamism that we see here, these sort of dynamic effects that we're seeing here, correspond to particular politically relevant points in DACA's life that are, of course, linked to the stability or the relative stability or instability of the program. And so let me just show you briefly what these cut points are. You have your pre-period, which of course is the time when everyone was undocumented. There was no DACA program yet. And June 15th, 2012 comes along and you get DACA. And then for the first 3 years, you have a pretty consistent program, very few explicit threats to the program or criticism of the program, a lot of optimism about the program. And then, as I mentioned, in the middle of June 2015 is when you start to see these very first threats to the program. And you start to see the US presidential campaign period begin. And you have a candidate that that announces their candidacy by saying horrible things about Mexican immigrants and about building a wall. And shortly after that, you have the CNN interview that I mentioned, where the candidate then says that they would eliminate the DACA program if they were elected into office and that they must go. And so this is a period where there's highly publicized anti-immigrant rhetoric and explicit threats to the program, but no explicit action against it. And then, of course, you have the actual rescinding of the program, which happens in September 2017, which DACA recipients describe as a real turning point in their mental health. Even the election, of course, was very important and significant to people. But the important thing about differences designs is that you would need to isolate something that impacts DACA recipients. And so the election impacted a lot of people beyond just DACA recipients. And a lot of us woke up the next day feeling helpless and hopeless and discouraged. And so it wasn't until September of 2017 that the termination of the program was actually announced. And that becomes this key turning point, at least in the narrative that DACA recipients have of their own stories. And just to kind of illustrate that again in another chart, this is basically just sort of a smoothed out version of that, the year-by-year chart that I just showed you. Except that it corresponds to these sort of politically relevant cut points. And again, you see these really significant improvements to psychological distress in the first post period where the program was not under any kind of real explicit threat, followed by an almost immediate reverting back to that the mean. So basically the same levels of stress as in the pre-DACA period when everyone was undocumented still. So a statistically indistinguishable stress level. In other words, people's distress returned back to that pre-DACA level. So I just want to I want to begin, so I'm going to talk about this whole graph, but I want to talk about first what happened in that first post period in the decline. And I think it's important because you probably already you've already anticipated what I'm going to say about why we saw these improvements, but I think it's important to mention it because I think there's still an opportunity for our elected officials to do right by these young people. Right? There's still an opportunity to flip another policy lever, and perhaps a more permanent one. And so we need to understand why this program may have been linked to improvements in health. And that can help underscore the importance of the program to begin with. And so while it's really important, and I'm going to focus on why distress scores, why the improvements to distress disappeared, I think it's also important to understand why the improvements appeared in the first place. And I want to do that using DACA recipients' own words and drawing on interviews that I did as part of the DACA longitudinal study. And the quotes, I'm going to show you just a few quotes, and they all come from interviews done in 2014 to early 15, so sort of prior to this period of explicit threats to the program. So for one thing, one of the biggest things that DACA did, and I previewed this before, is that it removed the chronic stressor and anticipatory stressor of deportation, right? The constant threat of discovery and deportation. And so one recipient said, DACA gave me the security of knowing you can actually be outside without worrying that you'll get deported. It also affected youth's identities and understandings of their own belonging in the United States. One person said, it's the first time I see a government agency accept me in this country, even when I considered myself an American, right? So these are very powerful quotes. Another person said, talked about all the kind of material benefits of the program and then said, I feel better emotionally, physically, and psychologically. DACA brings you into the community. And then this final one that I just find so profound. Peace. I can breathe better. Hope. Knowing I exist. I feel like I belong and other people know I exist. So I think all these quotes are powerful, and they demonstrate that DACA recipients start to feel less excluded, more optimistic, and more integrated into American sociocultural and political life, at least during the time that the program was not under threat. But of course, as we saw earlier, the story changes, right? So returning to these figures that we saw before, we saw that the improvements to health that then disappeared after 2015. And I want to say that some of you might be surprised by this. You might have thought, well, 2015, you were expecting something like this maybe for 2017, but why did the trend begin earlier? And I previewed that by talking about some of the language around the program and threats to the program that were introduced around this time. And I will show you some of the words that DACA recipients used to describe this period from interviews that I did in 2015 and 16, and then in 2018 to early 2019. So first, by the time 2015 had rolled around, respondents started to see that this temporary nature of the program was not going to be a permanent solution for them, right? The liminality of the program was underscored. Their status was still too uncertain to allow for long-term decision-making. And you can take this quote from a young person who was trying to decide whether to go back to school to obtain a master's degree, weighing the pros and cons. If he takes on this large loan, and at the end of the day, I'm just on this renewal basis, right? What happens if the next president comes along and changes things? And I invested all this in my education, and I'm not able to get a job and pay back all that money that I took out. So this sort of inability to make long-term decisions or a change in the way long-term decisions were being made. And so you can see that anticipatory stress about the future of the program coming through as early as 2015, because this individual was interviewed in fall of 2015. Other chronic and anticipatory stressors were renewed for DACA recipients. Many continued to worry about their family members who didn't qualify for DACA and so still remained undocumented and therefore under the threat of deportation. And that was particularly scary as the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric of the presidential campaign ramped up, and then after the election as well. People talked about being worried about parents being deported, and that became particularly prevalent through the course of the election. And people talked about it explicitly. If the leadership of this country changes, then we're screwed or we're detained, and that's a concern for me. Stress. I'm stressing about my future. I'm stressing about who the next president is going to be. Are they racist? Are they going to take DACA off? And that creates stress and anxiety for sure. So I think these quotes really exemplify and were foreshadowed by Dean Birdsell's remarks as well about the real anticipatory stress, the fear, the concern, the uncertainty that people had in thinking about their futures and their lives. And that is linked to their health and well-being, and can help explain why we would see distress scores go back up to the pre-DACA level when everybody was undocumented, and which I've already established is linked to all kinds of disadvantages for undocumented people. So for that stress to revert to that level is alarming. So let me now turn to the question of whether DACA has had spillover effects, and specifically whether it's impacted the children of DACA recipients. And it's interesting because DACA recipients are often referred to as DACA kids or DACA students. It's like Congress's inability to act on their future has permanently frozen them in time or something, right? But the oldest DACA recipients were 31 years old in 2012. So they're nearing 40 now. They're not children. And in fact, many DACA recipients are now parents themselves. And in the CHIS data, the California Health Interview Survey data that I'm looking at, the average child of a DACA-eligible mother is a U.S. citizen, of course, right? Because one of DACA's eligibility requirements is that the person had to have been in the U.S. for 5 years or more, right, at the time that that DACA was announced. And they're under 5 years old. So we are talking about the health of toddlers here, right, on average. You know, some are younger and some are older. This is the average age of the U.S. citizen children of DACA recipients. So I published a paper earlier this year in a journal called Health Affairs that asked this same kind of question of what have been the impacts over time, DACA's impacts over time, on the question I showed you earlier about self-rated health, you know, excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. Looking at people who reported good or better compared to people who reported fair or poor health. And I looked at that measure both for DACA-eligible people and also for the children of DACA-eligible mothers. And I found very, very similar results to what I just showed you for K6, for the Kessler-6 psychological distress scale. That is improvements to health, incredible improvements to health in that first 3-year period, both for DACA-eligible immigrants, but also for their young children. In fact, children's health improved, the likelihood of good or better health improved by 21% for those children in the first 3 years of the program relative to documented immigrants, the children of undocumented immigrants. And then those health improvements disappeared at the same time, as we saw with psychological distress. And which provides evidence that legal status stress is intergenerational, right? Children are very sensitive to stress processes going on in their families. Their health is linked to their parents' health. And it remains unclear to me, at least, how these children are going to fare over time. Seeing their parents' lives in this sort of ping pong of uncertainty. One journalist described it as a purgatory that few of us can imagine if you don't live in that status, right? To have your future on the line all the time. That children are sensitive to those things. They're sensitive to their parents' distress and stress. And it's unclear to me, and I think it's a question we need to continue to interrogate, is what's going to happen to those children over the long term. In addition to the children that you described, the children who are arriving to our country now, these also very young children who are going through horrific and traumatizing experiences. And so I think we need to pay a lot of attention to what's happening to the children. Okay, so I think taken together, all these results that I've just shown you about self-rated health, about psychological well-being for DACA recipients and for their children, they suggest that our health is sensitive to what's going on around us. Even something that on its face seems so abstract, right? Like federal policy making, that can be relatively abstract. But let me be clear, it's really important to understand these things. And that's because mental health and health is linked to everything in life. It's linked to our mobility and to our morbidity, right? So it's linked to both how far we can go in life and also, indeed, even to the length of our life, right? Stress is harmful. So understanding the extent to which people are experiencing stress helps us identify the policy levers that we can switch to then reduce that stress and try to improve people's lives. So what's next? I want to comment on the present moment, and as I conclude my remarks. Because I think that we are poised to observe significant increases in psychological distress in the coming years, depending on, of course, what happens and what the Supreme Court decides. You may have noticed that when I was talking about health scores, while they returned to the mean, they weren't worse than the pre-DACA levels. Right? Health didn't significantly worsen beyond those pre-DACA days for people. So in that sense, DACA may still be having some kind of protective effect for people, even in these anti-immigrant times. And that's why I have up here the first couple of pages of this amicus brief that Professor Smith and his team worked very hard on. I also worked on it along with a number of researchers across the social sciences who have done empirical work on legal status, immigrant legal status, and in particular on DACA. And you can see the table of contents of the brief, and I know Rob would be happy to send it to anyone who wants to read it, and it's available in the archives of this case. But what the data show pretty unequivocally is that DACA has had and is linked to all kinds of improvements in people's lives. So I talked about health, but in this brief you can read about improvements to labor force participation, to wages, to the types of jobs that people are getting, to the way they feel about the jobs that they're getting, that these jobs are commensurate with who I see myself as becoming in terms of my work life. It removes some of those limitations. There's also research on DACA's influence on education and the ways that DACA has influenced educational mobility for some of its participants. Right? And I've just shown you, of course, research on health, which is also in this brief. But as I said earlier, the court's decision, what happens in the next 6 months, is not clear. There's a lot of different scenarios that could play out. But what happens next, I think, will surely have health consequences for DACA recipients and their families. If DACA is terminated, it's not clear to me that life is simply going to stay at this sort of pre-program normal, right? In fact, people who have had DACA and lost it, if it's terminated, may feel even more vulnerable and distressed than they did even before the program was announced, because they've come to rely on the program as a path to inclusion and mobility. And of course, this will not only impact DACA recipients, but also, as I've emphasized, they're very, very young children and presumably other family members. So what this court does next, and what Congress does next, and what the next president does next is so very, very, very important. And as I said earlier, I think the treatment of immigrants during these past few years, I believe it's going to go down in history marked as one of the most shameful in our country's history. Infamously remembered alongside Chinese exclusion, infamously remembered alongside the mass deportation of Mexican nationals and even Mexican origin U.S. citizens in the 1930s, alongside Japanese internment. The question is whether in this moment in which the country has the opportunity to do right by a large and established group of immigrants who contribute every day to making our country, our nation, a better place, whether we're going to stand up for these young people or fail them miserably. But in the meantime, I have hope. And I have hope because DACA recipients and their families are going to continue to stand up for themselves. And they are going to say, regardless of what this court decides, we have dignity, we have rights, and we are home. And they're going to continue to take their fights to the Supreme Court and to the halls of Congress, as they've been doing since the first DREAM Acts were introduced in 2000, 2001, for 20 years now. And they will stay there until Congress makes a decision that acknowledges not just their contributions, but their health and their humanity. And it's our job as educators and community members to support them in every way we can. And I believe that we will prevail, because the moral arc of history is long, but sometimes, just sometimes, it does bend toward justice. And so I want to end with the words of Arundhati Roy, which I find very inspirational in these dark times. That another world is not only possible, but she is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. And I want to end by saying that on Tuesday, she was very, very loud. And let's see if we can hear this. Do I have audio? I don't know. Oh, I wish you could hear it. Home is here. Home is here. Home is here. Coming out of the Supreme Court. Thank you. That's a great question. The question was, would my results vary East Coast, West Coast, or depending on the area that I study? I think yes and no. One of the things so there are projects around that are looking at the impacts of DACA on all kinds of measures all around the country, including excellent work happening right here in New York State. I know of work out of Florida. I know of work that has compared Georgia, Colorado, and California. There's work looking at many different areas around the country. And there's a lot of evidence that the overarching climate around immigrants' rights will influence immigrants' well-being in general. And so states like California and New York, which have relatively friendly policy climates for immigrants, mean that what we see here should be the lower side of any estimate of DACA's impacts, both for potentially for better and for worse. It would indicate that there might already be a slightly higher level of well-being, a better well-being prior to the program and potentially throughout the program. And so it would bias the estimates towards zero. In other words, in other places in the country where you have a more restrictive climate, you might expect different outcomes. And so I'm looking forward to seeing other research around the country that can look at some of those, that can answer that question in more detail. But I do think what's happening at the federal level, there's evidence across all these projects. I think it's been in Rob's study and the Florida study and other studies that show that undocumented youth, that youth with DACA are reacting to the changes to the program in similar ways, and that their vulnerability is being underscored in similar ways because that program is the federal program. It's a great question.
What is the government planning if DACA is not acceptable? Is there a plan? Is it just throwing 825,000 people out into the wilderness, so-called? Mm-hmm. Is there a plan? I don't know of any, and I'm not going to be naive because this government doesn't make me very happy.
Thank you for that question. The question was, what might happen next? What's the government's plan? And I, like you, sir, would not pretend to be inside the minds of people making decisions about immigration right now. The cruelty has been just immeasurable. I mean, levels of cruelty that I did not think that we would ever see again toward immigrants in particular. But but presidents come and go. Elected officials come and go. Supreme Courts stay a little longer. But I think a lot depends on what happens in the next election. Even President Trump has backtracked on his earlier statements of let's get rid of them all. He even on Tuesday in a tweet said something about said some disparaging things about DACA recipients, but then said, if the court strikes it down, we'll work with the Dems to find a way to keep them here. So even at the same time that he was insulting them, he was also saying, I'm not actually going to deport this large group of people. So I can't make any predictions, of course, about what would happen. I think it would be, if you had asked me this, a year ago, I would have said there's no way that the U.S. government would ever deport this many people. It simply doesn't have the capacity or the political will. The cruelty that we've seen in the past couple of years has been beyond my wildest imagination. But I still don't think that's a reality just based on the resources it would take to do that. I think a political solution will come in some time. The question is going to be, what impact is that going to have on these DACA recipients? Their lives are in turmoil. And so maybe they won't get deported, but if the program's taken away for a little while, they have, there was a young person that I work with who, even in this time period when DACA is still in effect, it took a long time for her work authorization card to come in the mail. She lost her job during that time, and she couldn't get it back when she got her work authorization 6 weeks later. So I think, playing political ping pong with people's lives is not fair. And so all of this time, Congress has had the power to act and provide a more permanent solution, and has not. And so I think that those of us who are concerned citizens, we can continue to push them to do the right thing and to provide a permanent solution for young people that is not going to be subject to the political whims of future people in power.
One of my questions is related to stress, but not directly to the DACA recipients, but to the people around the DACA individual, and especially when we are encountering of DACA recipients who are losing their DACA because of minor fractions that might not be criminal, but it is in a context of the moral not to be able to renew DACA renewals, which is that one of the cases of one Baruch student is from the master's program of business, and he was just recently detained by immigration about 4 weeks ago, coming out of his house to Baruch, and I'm just learned that recently from friends, and I'm meeting with the lawyer just to see what actions can we take from the activist work, but especially how that sort of reflects on all the individuals around those DACA recipients.
I think that's right. I think that there's over 3 million mixed immigration status families in this country. That is families where at least one member of the household is undocumented. And, I've been focused on DACA recipients today, but the stress and uncertainty that any undocumented person feels in this country today has certainly been heightened over the past couple of years. And that stress does spill over onto other people who care about DACA recipients. In their families is, the area of my empirical area of focus, but surely also to anyone else who loves or cares about people who are experiencing these really extensive periods of liminal legality and legal uncertainty. That will impact many people beyond the individual. Thank you. And in terms of resilience and taking the hit, that's sort of why I wanted to end where I ended with, plaintiffs representing DACA recipients all around the country exiting the halls of the Supreme Court and saying, "We are home," right? And just the incredible activism that has emerged over the last 20 years, especially among this group of young people who have grown up in the United States. Many of us are familiar with people with events that undocumented young people call coming out events, saying I'm undocumented and unafraid, educating people about their statuses, being brave enough to say I'm undocumented, this has been my experience, as a way of putting a human face on an issue that faces so many people. And to help change hearts and minds. That's not so much about people's own resilience, but it's part of that effort to say, I'm not just going to sit here and take this. I'm going to make a change that impacts my own community. And I haven't looked in my own research in particular at resilience mechanisms, but surely you're right that people are strong and they are resilient and they learn to take the punches and live with what comes. But we could stop punching them.